Long before the silence fell, before the marble cracked and the gold was stripped away, there was a sound that emanated from the flank of Mount Parnassus. It was not a loud sound, often no more than a mutter, a gasp, or a shriek, but it was a sound that steered the course of human history. For over 1,000 years, the sanctuary of Delphi was the beating heart of the ancient world. It was the place where the veil between the mortal and the divine was thinnest, a tear in the fabric of reality where men could ask questions and the gods would answer. To the Greeks, this was not merely a temple. It was the omphalos, the navel of the world. It was the center point where Zeus's two eagles, released from opposite ends of the earth, had met in the sky. In the 6th century BC, at the height of its terrifying power, Delphi was not a ruin of white stone as we see it today. It was a sensory overload of color and wealth. The sacred way, the winding path that led up the mountainside to the great temple, was lined with 3,000 bronze statues. These were not modest dedications. They were colossal monuments to ego and piety, erected by the city-states of Greece to commemorate their victories over one another. The air would have smelled of galbanum incense and roasting meat from the eternal sacrifices, and the sound of the wind through the pines would have been drowned out by the polyglot chatter of the world. Kings from Lydia, tyrants from Sicily, and envoys from Egypt, shoulder to shoulder with peasant farmers, all waiting for their moment to ascend. They came because they were afraid. In a world governed by capricious gods, where a harvest could fail or a city could burn at the whim of Olympus, Delphi offered the one thing that money and armies could not buy: certainty, or at least the illusion of it. The political landscape of the Mediterranean was decided here. Before a colony was founded in Italy, before a fleet sailed against Persia, before a law was codified in Sparta, the question was first carried up the mountain. To ignore Delphi was to invite catastrophe. The priests of Apollo, the Hosioi, held the keys to the future, acting as the first true intelligence agency of the ancient world. They gathered news from every corner of the earth, listening to the gossip of the pilgrims, weaving a web of information that made their prophecies seem miraculously informed. But the true power of Delphi did not lie in the politics of the priests. It lay in the dark, cramped chamber beneath the temple floor, the Adyton. This was the forbidden room, the Holy of Holies, where the god Apollo descended to possess his vessel. And his vessel was not a high-born queen or a magician. She was the Pythia. The Pythia was the most powerful woman in the ancient world, yet she was often a nobody. In the early days, she was a young virgin, but after a series of scandals and assaults, the priesthood changed the custom. At the height of the oracle's influence, the Pythia was usually a woman past 50, a peasant from the local village of Delphi, chosen for her blameless life and her simplicity. When her time came to serve, she ceased to be a woman. She became a void. The ritual of prophecy was a harrowing ordeal of purification and intoxication. Before she could speak for the god, the Pythia was taken to the Castalian spring, which flowed from the rocks east of the sanctuary. There, in the freezing mountain water, she washed her body and her hair. She drank from the Cassoda stream, said to grant inspiration. The priest would test the willingness of the god by sprinkling cold water on a goat. If the beast shivered, it was a sign that Apollo was present and ready to speak. The goat was slaughtered, its blood staining the altar, and the Pythia was led into the temple. She descended into the sunken Adyton, a space so small and enclosed that the air would have been stagnant and heavy. She took her seat on the tripod, a 3-legged bronze stool positioned directly over a chasm in the bedrock, the chasma. From this fissure rose the pneuma, the breath of the god. For centuries, historians dismissed this as a myth, but geological studies have since revealed that Delphi sits directly over the intersection of two major fault lines. As the earth ground together, friction heated the limestone, releasing gases, ethylene, ethane, and methane, into the water of the spring and the air of the chamber. These were sweet-smelling, hallucinogenic vapors. The Pythia was literally inhaling the earth. As the gas flooded her lungs, she entered a state of enthusiastic delirium, enthusiasmos, having the god inside. Her limbs would tremble, her voice would alter, and she would begin to babble. It was not a speech. It was a stream of consciousness, a chaotic eruption of words, cries, and songs. The priest stood nearby, listening intently, translating these incoherent sounds into the polished hexameter verse that would be delivered to the petitioner. It was a terrifying performance. To stand before the Pythia was to stand before a human being who was being hollowed out and filled with a divine fire. There were times when the possession was so violent that the Pythia would collapse and die days later, her body unable to withstand the trauma of the connection. The answers she gave were legendary for their ambiguity, a safety mechanism that ensured the oracle could never be wrong. When Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia, asked if he should attack the rising Persian Empire, the Pythia replied that if he crossed the river Halys, he would destroy a great empire. Emboldened, Croesus attacked. He was crushed. His own empire was the one destroyed. When he complained to the priests, they replied that he should have asked which empire. The fault lay with the listener, not the god. This intellectual dominance held the Greek world in a grip of iron. For 3 centuries, Delphi was untouchable. It was the central bank of Greece, hoarding gold in its treasuries that rivaled the wealth of nations. It was the supreme court, arbitrating disputes between cities to prevent war. It was the conscience of a civilization. The Persians came in 480 BC, intending to sack the sanctuary, but were turned back by a miraculous rockfall and a thunderstorm that the priest claimed was Apollo defending his home. The Gauls came in 279 BC and met a similar fate. The oracle seemed eternal, a fixed point in a turning universe. But the seeds of silence were being sown even in the Golden Age. The world was changing. In Athens, philosophers like Socrates and Plato began to ask questions that did not require a priest to answer. They sought truth in logic, not in the vapors of a chasm. In Macedon, a new kind of king was rising, Philip and his son Alexander, who viewed the oracle not as a divine master, but as a political tool to be bullied. The old reverence was beginning to curdle into cynicism. The navel of the world was starting to look less like a conduit to the divine and more like a mechanism of control, run by men who were all too human. Yet, as the sun set over the Phaedriads in the 4th century BC, no one could have imagined that the voice would ever stop. The fires still burned. The goats still shivered. The gold still flowed up the mountain. The silence was coming, but it would not arrive with a bang. It would arrive with the slow, grinding march of legions from the west, bringing with them a pragmatism that had no room for riddles. The god was about to face his greatest challenge, the indifference of a new master. By the 2nd century BC, the geopolitical tectonic plates had shifted. The center of gravity in the Mediterranean was no longer Athens, Sparta, or even Macedon. It had moved west, across the Adriatic, to a city of brick and wolf's milk, Rome. The Romans were a pious people, deeply superstitious and respectful of foreign gods, but their piety was practical. They viewed religion as a contract due a day. I give so that you may give. When they looked at Greece, they did not see a spiritual motherland to be revered. They saw a chaotic, bickering collection of city-states that needed to be brought to heel. And when they looked at Delphi, they saw something else entirely, a bank vault. The sanctuary had survived the Persians and the Gauls because those invaders were viewed as barbarians, forces of chaos that rallied the Greeks to defend their sacred soil. But the Romans were different. They came as liberators, then as arbitrators, and finally as masters. Initially, the Senate treated the oracle with diplomatic courtesy, consulting it during the Punic Wars. But the mystic aura was fading. To the pragmatic Roman mind, the riddles of the Pythia were frustratingly inefficient. They preferred their own auguries, the flight of birds, the entrails of sheep, methods that could be conducted on the battlefield by a general without the need for a mountain trek and a cryptic translation. Delphi was becoming a quaint relic, a tourist destination for the educated elite, but politically, it was losing its teeth. The true turning point, the moment the sanctity of the site was irrevocably shattered, came in 86 BC. The First Mithridatic War was raging across Greece. Mithridates VI of Pontus, a brilliant and ruthless king from the east, had risen up against Roman rule, and many Greek cities, chafing under the Roman tax burden, had joined him. Rome responded by sending Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was a new breed of Roman general, cold, brilliant, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He needed money to pay his legions, who were besieging Athens. He looked at the treasuries of the Greek sanctuaries not as holy ground, but as lines of credit. He sent a soldier named Caiaphas to Delphi with a simple order: liquidate the assets. Caiaphas, a Greek himself, was terrified. He arrived at the sanctuary trembling, weeping as he relayed the general's demands to the priests. The priests, desperate to save their god's home, tried to play on the soldier's superstition. They claimed that the lyre of Apollo could be heard playing spontaneously in the inner sanctum, a sign of the god's presence and anger. Caiaphas sent word back to Sulla, begging him to reconsider, citing the miracle. Sulla's reply was a masterpiece of cynical wit. He wrote back that he was delighted to hear the god was playing music, for music was a sign of joy, not anger. Therefore, Apollo was clearly happy to give his wealth to Rome. He ordered Caiaphas to pack up the gold and stop wasting time. The looting of 86 BC was a psychic wound from which Delphi never truly recovered. It was not just the theft of the silver craters, the golden shields, and the ancient dedications of kings. It was the revelation of powerlessness. For centuries, the Greeks believed that Apollo would strike down anyone who dared to touch his property. Sulla touched it. He melted it down. He minted it into coin to pay mercenaries, and nothing happened. No lightning bolt struck the Roman camp. No plague withered the legions. Sulla went on to conquer Athens, defeat Mithridates, and become the dictator of Rome. The lesson was brutal and clear. The gods were either dead, or they were on the side of the battalions with the heaviest iron. In the aftermath of the solemn sack, the sanctuary fell into a deep depression. The flow of dedications dried up. Why give gold to the god if a Roman general could simply take it? The physical decay of the site accelerated. The great amphitheater, once the stage for the Pythian Games, began to crack. The gymnasium, where athletes had trained for centuries, grew silent. The population of Delphi, which had lived off the pilgrim trade, dwindled. The oracle still functioned, but the questions changed. Kings no longer asked about the fate of empires. They had no empires left to lose. Instead, the petitioners were local merchants asking about trade deals, or fathers asking about the paternity of their children. The navel of the world had become a local fortune teller. The Roman civil wars that followed only deepened the misery. Greece became the battlefield where Pompey fought Caesar, and later, where Octavian fought Antony. Delphi was caught in the middle, taxed and trampled by passing armies. It was a desolate time. The Greek writer Plutarch, who would later serve as a high priest at Delphi, wrote of this period with a profound melancholy. He noted that in the old days, there had been 2 or 3 Pythias working in shifts to handle the crowds. Now, there was only one, and she had plenty of free time. The pneuma, the divine gas, seemed to be weakening as well. Plutarch speculated on whether the earth itself was running out of breath, or if the god had simply turned his face away. Yet, even in its twilight, the name of Delphi still held a ghostly resonance. When Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC, becoming the Emperor Augustus, he made a gesture of restoration. He reorganized the Amphictyonic League, the council that governed the sanctuary. He returned some of the stolen statues, though not the gold. He tried to revive the Pythian Games, but it was a hollow restoration. Augustus was not interested in the truth of the oracle. He was interested in the utility of the past. He used Delphi as a symbol of his new ordered world, a museum piece to validate his reign. The oracle was no longer a dangerous voice of the divine. It was a state-sponsored heritage site. The relationship between the emperors and the oracle became a strange dance of patronage and contempt. Some emperors, like Domitian, repaired the temple. Others ignored it completely. But the most bizarre and damaging interaction was yet to come. As the 1st century AD progressed, a new madness took hold of the throne in Rome. The Emperor Nero, a man who fancied himself an artist greater than Apollo, turned his gaze toward Greece. He did not come to ask a question. He came to demand applause. And in his wake, he would leave the sanctuary stripped not just of its wealth, but of its dignity. By the middle of the 1st century AD, the silence encroaching upon Delphi was not merely a result of neglect. It was a symptom of a world that had lost its capacity for awe. The Roman Empire had swallowed the Mediterranean whole, and with it, the independent spirit of the Greek city-states that had once sustained the oracle. But in the year 67 AD, the sanctuary was subjected to a violation far more bizarre and damaging than the cold pragmatism of Sulla. The Emperor Nero arrived in Greece. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was not a man who sought wisdom. He sought validation. He did not view himself primarily as a ruler, but as an artist, a singer, a charioteer, a poet, and an actor. He had traveled to Greece not to inspect the legions or adjust the tax codes, but to embark on a grotesque concert tour. He demanded that all the great Panhellenic games, the Olympics, the Isthmian, the Nemean, and the Pythian, be held in a single year, disrupting centuries of sacred calendars so that he could sweep the board. He moved through the countryside like a plague of locusts wrapped in gold and purple, accompanied by a retinue of thousands of Augustiani, professional claqueurs trained to applaud his performances with rhythmic precision. When his traveling circus arrived at the slopes of Parnassus, the priests of Apollo faced a terrifying diplomatic crisis. In the past, they had dealt with tyrants who wanted to conquer the world, men whose ambitions were bloody but understandable. Nero's ambition was delusional. He wanted to be recognized as the supreme artist, a rival to Apollo himself. He entered the sanctuary not as a humble petitioner, but as a conquering celebrity. He demanded to compete in the musical contests of the Pythian Games, an event established to honor the god of music. It was a farce. The emperor sang, his voice thin and straining, accompanying himself on the lyre. The judges, terrified for their lives, declared him the victor. He was awarded the laurel wreath, the sacred symbol of the god, which he placed on his head with no sense of irony. He was a mortal man wearing the god's crown in the god's own house, while the true voice of the sanctuary, the Pythia, remained silent in the rock. But Nero's vanity was fragile. He was deeply insecure, haunted by the matricide of his mother Agrippina and the growing unrest in the provinces. He eventually decided to consult the oracle, perhaps hoping for a poetic verse that would immortalize his reign. The encounter between the unhinged emperor and the aging priestess is shrouded in legend, but the tone of it is consistent across the histories. The oracle, in a moment of suicidal bravery or perhaps unable to control the pneuma, gave him a prophecy that stung. Some sources say she warned him to beware the age of 73. Nero, being only 30, was delighted, thinking he had decades of life left. He did not realize the god was mocking him. The man who would overthrow him, Galba, was 73 years old. Other accounts suggest a darker confrontation. They claim the Pythia dared to allude to his mother's murder, comparing him to Orestes, the mythical matricide. Nero's reaction was explosive. He was not a man who tolerated criticism, least of all from a hallucinating woman in a cave. He decided that if the god would not sing his praises, the god would be punished. He did not burn the temple down. That would have been too crude for an artist. Instead, he decided to strip the house of Apollo of its beauty. He would curate the sanctuary by looting it. The theft that followed was one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in history. Sulla had taken the gold and silver because he needed money for war. Nero took the art because he wanted to decorate his palace. He ordered the removal of 500 of the finest bronze statues from the sanctuary. These were not generic figures. They were the masterpieces of the archaic and classical ages, votive offerings that had stood for centuries as the physical prayers of the Greek people. They were loaded onto wagons and carted away to Rome to adorn the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house. Imagine the visual impact of this removal. For generations, the approach to the temple had been a forest of bronze, a crowded, glittering testimony to the gratitude of the world. Now, suddenly, there were gaps. Empty plinths stood like tombstones along the sacred way. The visual density of the site, which had created a sense of overwhelming divine presence, was thinned out. The sanctuary began to look abandoned. It was a psychological blow as much as a physical one. It signaled that Delphi was no longer the repository of the world's memory. It was a quarry for the whims of a Roman sociopath. But Nero went further. In a fit of pique, perhaps because the oracle continued to disturb him, or perhaps simply because he could, he attacked the very mechanism of the prophecy. The Roman historian Suetonius claims that Nero ordered the sacred cleft, the chasma from which the vapors rose, to be filled with corpses. While this is likely a gruesome exaggeration, it reflects the violence of his intent. He did, however, strike at the economic heart of the sanctuary. He confiscated the Syrian plain, the fertile valley below the mountain that belonged to Apollo, and divided it among his soldiers. This was the land that generated the revenue to feed the priests and maintain the temples. By giving it away, he was effectively starving the god. He also abolished the rights of the Amphictyonic League, the ancient council that governed the site, and transferred control to his own bureaucrats. The oracle was degraded from an international independent body to a department of the imperial household. The Pythia was no longer the bride of Apollo. She was a civil servant in a failing administration. When Nero finally left Greece in 68 AD, summoned back to Rome to face the revolt that would end his life, he left a sanctuary that was traumatized. The noise of his Augustiani faded, but the silence that returned was different. It was the silence of emptiness. The 500 statues were gone, never to return. The land was occupied by Roman veterans who cared nothing for the god. The prestige of the oracle had been dragged through the mud of Nero's ego. He had turned the navel of the world into a stage prop for his own delusions, and in doing so, he broke the spell of reverence that had protected the site for 1,000 years. The Greek traveler Pausanias, visiting Delphi a century later, would walk through the sanctuary with a guidebook in hand, pointing out the statues that were missing, the empty bases where history used to stand. He wrote with the sadness of a man walking through a graveyard that had been robbed. The Nero interlude proved that the gods were helpless against the madness of emperors. Apollo had not struck Nero down with a plague or a thunderbolt. Nero had died by his own hand, chased by his own generals. The lesson was stark. The divine protection was a myth. Delphi was mortal. And like all mortal things, it was beginning to die. 3 centuries after Nero stripped the sanctuary of its bronze, the world had become unrecognizable. The Roman Empire, once the great persecutor of the Galilean sect, had knelt before the cross. Constantine the Great had seen a vision in the sky and turned the machinery of the state toward the worship of Jesus Christ. The old gods, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, were not dead, but they were dying. They had been demoted to the status of demons, their temples closed or converted, their sacrifices banned. The smoke no longer rose from the altars of the Mediterranean. The air was clearing, but for those who loved the ancient ways, it was a suffocating clarity. In the year 361 AD, however, history held its breath. A new emperor ascended the throne. Flavius Clodius Julianus, known to history as Julian the Apostate, was a man out of time. He was a nephew of Constantine, raised in the strict, paranoid confines of a Christian court that had murdered his family. But in the secret chambers of his heart, and in the lecture halls of Athens where he had studied, Julian belonged to the past. He fell in love with the beauty of Homer, the logic of Plato, and the mysteries of the old cults. When he became the master of the Raman world, he revealed his true face. He washed the baptismal water from his forehead with the blood of a bull. He grew a beard in the style of the Greek philosophers, a visual rejection of the clean-shaven Christian bureaucrats who surrounded him. And he set himself a task that was as noble as it was impossible. He would save the gods. Julian was not merely a romantic. He was a fanatic of the old order. He viewed the decline of the sanctuaries not just as a cultural tragedy, but as a spiritual catastrophe that endangered the empire. He believed that Rome's strength came from the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. To restore the empire, he had to restore the temples. And there was no temple more symbolic of the old world soul than Delphi. But the Delphi that Julian looked toward was a wreck. It had suffered terribly in the intervening years. The Herulian Goths had sacked it in the 3rd century, smashing what Nero had left. The Christians, emboldened by imperial favor, had begun to dismantle the outer shrines for building materials. The great theater was silent. The stadium was overgrown. The Pythoness, if she still existed, was no longer a celebrated conduit of divine will, but an old woman hiding in the rubble, fearful of the zealous monks who roamed the countryside smashing idols. Julian decided to act. He did not send a legion to occupy the site. He sent a healer. Oribasius of Pergamon was Julian's personal physician and his closest friend. He was a man of science and a man of faith, uniquely qualified to diagnose the sickness of the sanctuary. In 362 AD, Julian dispatched Oribasius to Phocis with a treasury of gold and a mandate: clear the rubble, rebuild the walls, and wake the god. It was a mission of resurrection. The journey of Oribasius to Delphi is one of the most poignant episodes in the history of religion. We can imagine the physician riding up the mountain path, his heart heavy with the emperor's expectations. He would have passed the abandoned treasuries of the Greek city-states, now empty shells, their doors hanging off their hinges. He would have seen the inscriptions of the victors of the Persian wars, now faded and covered in moss. The vibrant, chaotic marketplace of ideas that had once defined this place was gone. There were no pilgrims sleeping in the porticos, no merchants selling votive tripods. There was only the wind and the bleating of goats grazing in the sacred precinct. When Oribasius arrived at the Temple of Apollo, the devastation was total. The great Doric columns, which had once held up the roof that sheltered the god, were cracked or fallen. The Adyton, the holy cellar where the oracle sat, was choked with debris. The spring of Castalia, where the Pythia washed, was likely silted up with mud, but Oribasius was methodical. He set his men to work. They cleared the weeds. They tried to shore up the collapsing masonry. They sought out the local priests, men who had been living in poverty, keeping the flame alive in secret. They tried to organize a sacrifice to restart the spiritual engine that had been stalled for generations. The tension in this moment was palpable. It was the clash between one man's will and the crushing momentum of history. Julian believed that if he poured enough gold and enough blood onto the altars, the gods would return. He believed that the silence was a choice the gods had made because they had been neglected, and that they could be wooed back. He did not understand that a religion dies not when its temples are destroyed, but when it loses its hold on the imagination of the people. The locals who watched Oribasius work likely viewed him with a mixture of pity and fear-pity for his delusion, and fear of the Christian reprisals that would surely come when the emperor was gone. Oribasius worked through the year, trying to create a space fit for a divine voice. He washed the stones. He reconsecrated the altar. He found a woman willing to serve as the Pythia, perhaps a descendant of the old priestly families, or simply a local elderly woman who remembered the old rites. He prepared the question that Julian had sent. It was not a question about war or harvest. It was a question about the future of the faith itself. Julian wanted to know, can the order be restored? Will Apollo speak again? The physician stood before the ruins of the temple, the smell of fresh incense battling the scent of decay. He waited for the pneuma. He waited for the shudder of the earth. He was trying to jumpstart a heart that had stopped beating. And as the sun dipped below the Phaedriad's rocks, casting the valley into shadow, Oribasius realized that the true tragedy was not the destruction of the stone, but the absence of the spirit. The stage was set, the costumes were dusted off, but the lead actor had left the theater long ago. The year was 362 AD. The physician Oribasius stood in the heart of the sanctuary, but the heart was barely beating. He had spent weeks in Delphi, overseeing the clearing of the rubble, the scrubbing of the altar, and the desperate attempts to reconstruct the physical apparatus of prophecy. But a temple is more than stone. It is a machine that runs on faith, and the engine was broken. The priests he had found were shadows of the great hierarchs of the past. They were men who had forgotten the complex rituals, men who had lived in fear of Christian mobs for decades. They moved through the clean precinct with a tentative, frightened energy, looking over their shoulders at the hills, waiting for the monks to descend. Julian's question burned in Oribasius's pocket. The emperor did not want a vague horoscope. He wanted a mandate. He wanted Apollo to declare, in his own voice, that the Galilean usurpation was over and that the Olympians had returned to claim their throne. Oribasius had prepared the sacrifice with surgical precision. He had secured a goat, perhaps the last one the temple could afford. He had purified himself in the Castalian spring, though the water was choked with weeds. He approached the Adyton, the holy chasm, expecting or at least hoping for the earth to shake. He hoped to smell the sweet, cloying scent of the pneuma, the divine gas that signaled the presence of the god. But the air in the chamber was stale. It smelled of damp earth and old dust, the smell of a tomb, not a womb. The geological fissures that had once vented the hallucinogenic gases had shifted over the centuries, sealed by earthquakes or simply exhausted by time. The earth was no longer breathing. The Pythia who sat before him was not the terrifying vessel of divine fury described by Herodotus. She was a tired old woman, perhaps a local peasant who remembered the old songs, or the last surviving member of a hereditary line that had run dry. She sat on a stone block because the famous bronze tripod had been stolen by Constantine years earlier to decorate his new capital in Constantinople. There was no gold, no silver, no choir of chanting priests. There was just a doctor, a beggar woman, and the crushing weight of silence. Oribasius waited. He watched the woman, hoping for the signs of enthusiasmos, the trembling limbs, the foaming mouth, the dilated eyes. He wanted to see the god take hold of her, but the possession did not come. The Pythia sat still, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the ruined ceiling. She was not struggling with a divine presence. She was listening to an absence. The connection had been severed. The phone was off the hook. Then she spoke. It was not the booming voice of Apollo, nor the cryptic hexameter verse of the classical age. It was a whisper, a simple prose sentence delivered with the devastating clarity of a death notification. The words she spoke were recorded by the Christian historian Philostorgius and preserved in the Byzantine lexicon Suda. They are perhaps the most famous last words of any religion in human history. She said, "Tell the king, the fair wrought house has fallen. No shelter has Apollo, nor sacred laurel leaves. The fountains are now silent. The voice is stilled." Oribasius froze. He was a man of logic, a scientist who categorized diseases and cures, but he understood poetry. He understood that he had just been handed an obituary. The oracle was not giving a prediction. It was giving a resignation. Let us parse the message, for in its brevity lies a tragedy of epic proportions. The fair wrought house has fallen. This was an admission of physical defeat. The temple, the naos that had stood for 1,000 years, was broken. The god had no roof. No shelter has Apollo. This was the theological killshot. In the ancient world, a god lived in his temple. It was his house. If he had no shelter, he was a vagrant. The Pythia was saying that Apollo was homeless. He had been evicted by history. nor sacred laurel leaves. The laurel was the symbol of prophecy, the tree into which the nymph Daphne had transformed to escape Apollo's lust. To say there were no laurel leaves was to say there was no more magic, no more connection to the mythical past. The fountains are now silent, the voice is stilled. The water of Castalia and Cassotis, the physical mediums of purification and inspiration, had dried up. The mechanism was dead. The pneuma was gone. Oribasius stood in the dim light, the scroll in his hand heavy as lead. He realized he could not fix this. All the gold in Julian's treasury, all the marble in the Pentelic quarries, could not bring the voice back. You can rebuild a wall, but you cannot rebuild a mystery once it has been solved by time. The magic of Delphi relied on the collective belief of the world, the belief that this specific spot was the center of the universe. That belief had evaporated. The world had moved on to new capitals, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, and new gods who did not live in caves, but in heaven. Apollo was not angry. He was obsolete. The physician turned and walked out of the Adyton. He left the old woman sitting in the dark. There was no thunder, no lightning. The silence that followed her words was the true answer to Julian's question. It was the silence of an empty room after the guests have gone. Oribasius had the terrible duty of carrying this message back to the emperor. He rode east toward Antioch, where Julian was preparing for his Persian campaign. One can only imagine the journey. Every mile he rode away from Delphi, the realization deepened. The pagan revival was over before it had begun. When he finally stood before Julian and read the message, the emperor, the philosopher, warrior who had bet his soul on the old gods wept. He understood. He did not send more money. He did not order executions. He accepted the verdict. Julian would die shortly after, struck by a spear in the sands of Persia, reportedly whispering, "You have won, Galilean." But the true defeat had happened months earlier, in a dusty ruin on the side of a mountain, when a lonely old woman told the truth. The oracle had fallen silent not because it was suppressed, but because it had nothing left to say. The long conversation between humanity and the Olympian gods, which had begun in the mists of the Bronze Age, was over. The prophecy of the old woman in 362 AD was the death certificate of the oracle. But the funeral did not take place immediately. For another generation, the sanctuary lingered in a twilight state, a ghost town inhabited by a few stubborn priests and the memories of a glorious past. But in the year 380, the final blow was struck. It did not come from a foreign invader or a natural disaster. It came from the pen of a bureaucrat. The Emperor Theodosius I was a man of singular conviction. Unlike Constantine, who had tolerated the old gods while favoring the new, Theodosius was a militant Nicene Christian. He viewed paganism not as a rival faith, but as a demonic contagion that had to be purged from the body of the state. He issued a series of decrees, the Theodosian decrees, that outlawed sacrifices, closed the temples, and made the worship of insensate idols a crime of high treason. The legal protection that had shielded Delphi for a millennium was stripped away. The navel of the world was now an illegal squat. The enforcement of these decrees was brutal. It was not left to the local police. It was carried out by bands of roving monks and imperial officials, men whom the pagan orator Libanius described as men in black robes who eat more than elephants. They descended upon the countryside with the fervor of revolutionaries. When they arrived at Delphi in the 390s AD, they did not come to debate theology. They came to erase history. The destruction was systematic. The great altar of the Chians, where the smoke of hecatombs had once risen to feed the Olympians, was smashed to pieces. The remaining statues, those that Nero and Constantine had missed, were toppled. The black robes saw demons in the marble eyes of the gods, and they gouged them out with chisels. The sacred laurel tree, the living link to the myth of Daphne, was hacked down. The eternal fire, which had burned in the Prytaneum for over 1,000 years, was extinguished. The extinguishing of a fire is a quiet act, a hiss of water, a puff of smoke, but in that moment, the spiritual light of the ancient world went out. The Christians viewed this as a liberation, a cleansing of the earth from the tyranny of superstition. But for the locals, who had lived in the shadow of Apollo for countless generations, it must have felt like the end of the world. The god did not fight back. The earth did not shake. The silence that Oribasius had encountered in the Adyton spread outward, covering the entire valley. Delphi was no longer a sanctuary, it was a quarry. Nature, sensing that the guardians were gone, moved in to finish the job. Without the maintenance of the terraced walls and the drainage systems, the mountain began to reclaim its own. Landslides, triggered by the frequent earthquakes of the region, rolled down the Phaedriades cliffs. They buried the temple, the theater, and the stadium under tons of rock and mud. The Castalian spring overflowed and turned the entrance into a swamp. Slowly, inexorably, the navel of the world disappeared from the map. The name Delphi was forgotten. In its place, a poor village grew up over the ruins. It was called Castri. The illiterate peasants of Castri built their huts using the marble blocks of the treasuries. They used the drums of Doric columns as tables. They used inscriptions containing the treaties of kings as doorsteps. For 1,500 years, the people of Castri lived their lives literally on top of the ancient world, unaware that the floor of their church was the ceiling of the oracle. The silence was total. The voice that had guided the colonization of the Mediterranean, the voice that had humbled Croesus and warned Nero, was now just a whisper in the dreams of shepherds. It was not until the late 19th century that the silence was broken not by a priest, but by the pickaxe of an archaeologist. The Great Excavation, or La Grande Fouille, began in 1892, led by the French school at Athens. But before they could dig, they had to move the living. The entire village of Castri had to be bought, demolished, and rebuilt a mile down the road. It was a massive operation, a forced relocation of the present to reveal the past. As the French engineers peeled back the layers of earth, the sanctuary began to emerge from its tomb. They found the sacred way, the treasury of the Athenians, and the foundations of the temple. But they found something else, something that had miraculously survived the looting of Sulla, the vanity of Nero, and the hammers of the monks. Buried deep in the debris of a landslide, preserved by the very earth that had silenced the oracle, was a bronze statue, the charioteer. He was part of a larger victory monument, dedicated by a tyrant of Sicily in the 5th century BC. He stood tall, wearing the long tunic of a driver, his hands clutching the reins of horses that were no longer there. But it was his face that captivated the world. He possessed the severe style of early classical art, a look of intense, focused calm. His eyes, made of glass and stone, were still intact. When the excavators wiped the dirt from his face, he stared back at them with a gaze that had not been seen for 2 millennia. He was a survivor. He was a witness. The discovery of the charioteer and the ruins of Delphi did not bring the oracle back to life. The pneuma is gone. The Adyton is empty. But it brought a different kind of voice to the site. Today, Delphi is no longer silent. It is filled with the babel of tourists from every nation on earth, wandering the ruins with guidebooks in hand, trying to comprehend the scale of what was lost. It has regained its status as a place of pilgrimage, though the pilgrims now seek history, not prophecy. Yet there is a strange irony in the modern experience of Delphi. We climb the same path as the ancients. We look at the same eagle circling the Phaedriades, and we are confronted by the same inscriptions that were carved into the temple porch. Know thee Soten, know thyself, and Medon Agen. Nothing in excess. The oracle fell silent because the mechanism of the divine broke down, and the world stopped asking questions. But the answers that Delphi provided, the wisdom of self-awareness, the danger of hubris, the limits of human knowledge, are more durable than the stone itself. The god Apollo may have been evicted, and his priestess may have died in obscurity, but the mandate of the mountain remains. The day the oracle fell silent was the day humanity was forced to start answering its own questions. And in the echo of the ruins, if you listen closely enough, you can hear that we are still trying.